Welcome to the Golf Optimalogy Breakdown, where I'll be going over winning lineups on DraftKings PGA contests. I'm your host, Chris No Bridge, and you can also find me on Twitter as Chris Nasty. That's Krinastee. You can also find me at the bottom of any leaderboard on the DraftKings lobby, so hopefully we start to turn that around. By day, I'm a PGA professional living in Camarillo, California. At night, we do the focus groups with the golf contests and see what we can put together. Usually not great, but we're here to try to fix that. On this show, I'll be breaking down the winning lineups in the 150 max GPPs, the 20 max birdie contest, the 3 max mulligan, single entry dogleg, and then eventually the Pat Mayo Open. After we've looked at all the winning lineups on those contests, we're going to compare them to the optimal lineups, the optimal lineup for the event, and the 6 players who made through the cut. Once we go through the top 20 players on DraftKings scorings, we'll talk about what got them there, what key stats were important for success, look at projected versus actual ownership, which pivot plays worked, were certain chalk plays the play you had to stick with. After that, we'll see how we could have gotten there, looking at all the different options. As you can probably tell and see, this is my first time doing this, so I appreciate your patience, but I'm going to do my best to provide you as much content looking into what we could have done, who are the top plays for the week, and how we can use this for success moving forward. At the end of all this, I do want to talk about next week's Rocket Mortgage Open. Hopefully, we can start to figure out which plays are the ways to go about it, how to build lineups, and then how to get to the promised land of the green screens. All right, so give me a second here. So let's first go over the winning players throughout the event. So number one, Tony Finau coming in at 10,500, scored 130 DK points, and we can tell from his ownership he was not a play that you did not have to know about. Everyone knew that Tony Finau was going to play well. Finished with 23% ownership. We projected him at 21, so even at 23, you kind of had to have him if he's going to be the winning player. The guy who broke down throughout the week, Scott Piercy, at 6,900. No one really knew he was going to play well. He hadn't played well here before and hadn't played well recently. As I'm sure you heard the broadcast, he had just changed caddy, changed coach, changed putter, changed everything, and got him almost to the promised land and finished actually in 4th place, as you can see here. Emiliano Grillo, Sungjae Im both finished tied for 2nd. Sungjae Im, also another person everybody was talking about, 20% ownership in the big events. And just so we all can see here, the MME stands for mass multi-entry. So this one specifically is from the 150 max $1 million pitch and putt contest. So coming in at 10,000, obviously another pricey player. So depending on how the optimal lineup works out, it's likely you needed both players. So we'll go over that in just a little bit here. James Hahn, Tom Hoagie both finished in 4th place, but respectively finished in 5th and 6th in DK points. Now, I think this is something important to look at here. It's one thing for a player to finish in 2nd, 4th, and obviously if they got there, they had a lot of birdies. They probably accrued a fair amount of DK points, but it is possible to accrue DK points and not necessarily finish in the top 5 or 10. As you can see here with Cameron Champ, he actually finished 7th in DraftKings points, but finished 16th in the actual tournament itself. Same with Cameron Davis. This is all laid out in DraftKings points for top 20 players, but we can see here that they outscored their final position. Even more impressively here is Cameron Percy. 3 Camerons all playing well. Cameron Percy finished 26th in the event, but finished 11th for DK points, or actually tied for 10th with Grayson Sigg. So clearly you have to make sure that we're trying to accrue birdie points, run streaks. So when we're looking at players, we're not just looking for people who finished near the top, but for players who actually outscore their position by getting lots of birdies and streaks and eagles. Scroll down just a little bit here. We can see much of the zone of the players who got here are in that 7K, 6K range. We'll go over this in just a minute, looking at in prior instances of this event. But you can see from a point standpoint, this E line here is the actual ownership versus projected. The only person here that was crazy is Cameron Davis at 30%, one of the top owned players in the whole slate. We had it projected at about 23%. He outpaced that to 30%. So you didn't necessarily have to have him, but he definitely was still a positive play even at his price point. Going down just a little bit here, These guys here at the ones, this is either 1 or less than 1% owned. So Cameron Percy, Kelly Kraft, Scott Kucheski, Lee Hodges, and Robert Streb, all minimally owned. So while if you had them, good for you. It's not likely you're going to have them in your traditional player pool. Lee Hodges, we had it projected at 4, so there was some talk of him playing better recently. So there was some reason for him to be in your player pool, but ultimately most guys stayed away and only kept it around 1. Well, I didn't put the rest of the points for the rest of the players here. I wanted to take a look at some of the higher owned players that didn't make the top 20 for DK ownership. Maverick McNeely at 93%, 9,300 was 28% owned. We had Brennan Steele, big chalk play, really highly owned in some of the higher buy-in events at 21%. Nick Hardy at 19%. Who else do we have down here that looked interesting? Wyndham Clark, you'll find in some of the lineups that actually won at 9%. Finished quite high. And moving on, these are all the guys who finished at 1% or less than 1% ownership. All right, so let's first go over some of the winning lineups here. So first want to go over, I'm sure you guys saw that we're going to go over the optimal in just a minute. But in the $20 150 max, which is $1 million prize pool, first place for $250,000, we can see that the lineup was a 2 10K players and 4 7K players with Finau, Sungjae, Doug Kim, Grillo, Hoagie, and Sig. Now, the reason why I had these guys in green is you'll see that in all these winning lineups, these 4 players were part of the optimal and also the ones that were most used. Of course, you can see with 23% ownership with Finau and Sungjae, and then Grillo and Hoagie both owned at 9%. That was pretty simple to put those 4 guys together. They weren't, pivot plays. These guys were relatively chalk in their price point. Whenever you get to around 10% in the 7K range, they're not necessarily chalk, but they're not necessarily pivot plays either. They're guys that people have talked about. There's good reasons why they're chosen in that area. So we've got those guys here. But this person went with Doug Gim and Grayson Sig. Grayson Sig got a great Saturday. Got to 86 points for the tournament, which is, I think, brought him over to in the top 10 here. Yeah, tied for top 10 with Danny Willett for points earned. So a great play to put in that lineup. As we scroll down just a bit here. So now we're in the $5 150 max, the $350,000 one. So this was a $50,000 first place prize. Again, we saw Finau, Im, and Grillo in that lineup, but this one had Hodges, Wyndham Clark, and Scott Piercy. If we look over, this is the only one that actually had Scott Piercy in any of the 5 events we're going to look over. Scott Piercy was not someone anyone was touting up. So for him to come through for 113 points at $6,900, less than 1% owned, was a real sweet play. This person, I had to imagine, had at least 100 lineups and was using a much larger player pool than most to have him in there. Left $500 left over in the lineup. Let's do a little comparison to the 150 max, the Millie event. That one left $300 left over in that lineup. Scroll down just a little bit here. We move over to the $33 single entry event. Now, something to talk about, obviously, if you're only going to be putting in one lineup, it's likely that your player pool is going to be a little bit more condensed and tight. You're not going to have quite as many of the players who are going to be at less than 1% owned. But if you can find one of those guys and get leverage, it's such a huge play for you. So in this case, Andrew Putnam came through with 80 points at $7,100, was less than 2% owned, but still had the 4 players that were that we're going to find in the optimal play here. So Tony Finau, Sungjae Im, Emiliano Grillo, and Tom Hoagie all were part of the optimal player pool. And we can see here the 2 plays outside of those 4 were Brendan Todd and Andrew Putnam. On to the next one in the $8 3 max mulligan. Finau, Im, Grillo, and Hoagie again. The 2 players he added in here were CT Pan and Doug Gim. So let's talk about just a minute here. We can see from those 4 players, if that was your core 4, it left you with 14,800 left over, which gives you a lot of different options in that 7K range. This person ended up filling it up all the way to the $50,000 budget, and went with CT Pan at 7,500 and Doug Gim at 7,300, who was cruising along into the last 5 holes and gave back 5 shots. So they probably should have been closer to 80 points, but nonetheless, still was 5% owned. So good ownership. Another 11% for CT Pan. Was talked up on this course for a bit for his course history. And as we move down now to the $3.20 max, same thing, Tony Finau, Sungjae Im, Grillo, Hoagie, also with Doug Kim, but also had Tom Kim. Now, Tom Kim here had 22% ownership. And if you saw in some of the higher buy-in 4K contests, he was up to 30 and 40% owned at his cost in his recent play. It made sense for him to be put in here. This one had $200 left over. It was still a unique lineup and brought home big dollars here in the 20 max. So now, having looked at all this, let's look at the optimal. So this, of course, is the lineup that could have brought you the most amount of points, most possible. So it had the four that a lot of the teams already had here in Tony Finau, Sungjae Im, Emiliano Grillo, and Tom Hoagie. Had those four as your core plays at 10-10, 7-6, 7-1. And the final two players, James Hahn and Scott Piercy, at 7,000 and 6,900. Now, what I would say is if it's going to be less than 1% owned, it's not likely that these players are going to be in your pool. So what I wanted to do is to see with the 14,800, what players could you have had that people talked about that weren't, crazy, anti-chalk plays that still got you there. So I'm going to scroll down here just a bit. So you could have had those normal four players that everybody had. If you put in Cam Champ at 7,800, Callum Tarrant at 7,000, both players at 6% and 7% owned were definitely players that people use were in a lot of player pools and brought you 622 points. That was more than all the other contests for first place. So this would have gotten you $250K in the big event, another $50K in the $5 150 max. And for them to get to here with relatively non-chalky plays, you have a 23% Finau, 20% Sungjae, 9% Grillo, 9% Hoagie, and then 6 and 7% Champ and Taryn. If you went with this lineup, you're bringing the big dollars in, and you didn't have to go completely out of the loop to make it happen. Now, what I want to do here is compare this to prior optimals, specifically with just this event. So if you can see here, what I want to show you is these are the top 10 DK players in the last 3 years plus this year. And I made a little chart here to show you how many players from each range are being used. So something we could definitely see looking back in prior years is the prevalence of the 7K player in the top 10. Now, obviously, the 7K player is the largest of the ranges, but it's not always the case that they all get into the top 10. So even going back to 2019, there were 4 guys in the 7K and 4 guys in the 6K. That was the year Matt Wolf won. Only 1 guy at the 10K above. So a predominant amount all coming in that lower range. In the next year, in 2020, 7 guys in the 7K range, including the winner, Michael Thompson. 2021, we had 5 guys in the 7K range, including the winner, Cam Champ. And then this year, we had 6 guys in the 7K range, with 2 guys in the 10K, 1 in the 8K, and 1 in the 6K. You can see the 9K range is a pretty weak range in the last 3 years. Actually, in the last 4 years, there hasn't been one instance in which the 9K player actually even made the top 10 in points scored. So when we're now to put this in context within other events, we can also see that. Let me show you here. Actually, before I get to that, I want to talk about money left over on the table. It's kind of a discussion point lots of people have is, should you be leaving money on the table? Well, if you do, the more money you leave on the table, the more likely you are to be unique, which is great, but you're also losing a bit of value because you're choosing players that, relatively speaking, shouldn't bring you as many points as the higher priced players. Having said that, if you look at 2021, the total cost of the team was $47,100 with almost $3,000 left over. The 2020 optimal left almost $5,000 left over. And in 2019, the optimal left almost $3,000 left over. So when you have events like this, where we have kind of a weaker field with a few players at the 9 and 10K range, you're more likely to have a lot of this range fill up your top 10. Now, what we're going to do next here is if we look at all builds, this is something I've got a database of 175 events going back to the 2017 Players Championship. And on here are the types of builds we have that actually end up becoming the optimal lineup. So this year, the optimal lineup, take a look here. So the optimal lineup in this one had 2 10K players, 3 7s, and a 6. So this 10-10, 7-7, 7-6 was a little less than 1,000 left over, was actually the same build used last week in the Barbasol. Now, obviously, last week we also had the British Open, which was won by Cam Smith. And now it was a 9-9, 8-8, 7-6 build with 100 left over. Lots of big name players. So you're going to have to find the value there and keep it less, keep the amount of money left over a little more minimal. But in the Barbasol, we also had 10-10, 7-7, 7-6 build with Molinex winning at 6,900. Now, 2 of the 10K players made it in there who did not win, whereas this one, we had 2 10K players who finished in the top 3, including the winner in Tony Finau. So we go back to here, we can see that specific build, the 10-10, 7-7, 7-6, has only occurred 3 times now in 175 events. So it's a pretty unique build. It's not, and even the 2 10K player build is a unique way as well. So 3, 5, 6, 8. So nine times in 175 events, we've had 2 10K players make the optimal lineup. Now, as we scroll down through here, let's kind of show you a few things that I've got in this little file here. So lineups where we start with the 10K players have been in 161% of the optimal lineups. And another 33% of the time, it starts with the 9K players. And then we've had a few lineups where 8K and 7K was actually where the lineup started at. Over here, we can see how many times each range has made in the optimal lineup. So in this case, we see that in 116 instances, the 10K player made the optimal lineup. There's been 148 9K players and on down here. I think kind of what's a little bit more interesting is the price of the winner. We've had a 10K player win just about 28% of the time, 9K 19%, 8K 17%, 7K 21%, and then drops down to 13% for the 6K players. If you're looking at which range is kind of outperforming its price, you can see here that the 7K range is the winner 21% of the time, which to me feels a little higher than it should be, especially when you look at the 8K range, which is 17%. Now, part of this is offset with the fact that you have more players than 7K range, so 8K is less likely to have it just based off of pure numbers. But as you can see here, it still bears out that the 7K range is more often the winner. Scroll over here just a little bit. When we're looking at the optimals for this year, this is something else I've been kind of tracking as well. So you can see per events. If we look at kind of the more prestigious events, the Masters leaves 100 on the table with 10, 10, 9, 6, 6, 6 lineup. We look at the what else do we have here? Players Championship left 3,000. That was a bit unique in that sense. API Bay Hill 49,000 was the cost of the team with 1,000 left over. PGA Championship left 1,600 on the table. Now we look at U.S. Open, only left 100 on the table. Then you look at the kind of, let's say, weaker field events. So the RBC Canadian, Rory won that one, but still left 1,500 on the table. John Deere Classic left 800 on the table. What I essentially want people to see from this is that you should be looking to try to leave more and more money on the table if you're trying to go after the optimal lineup. Now, I'm not saying that is exactly the way you should be playing, because in totality, when you're going after the optimal lineup, you're going for perfection. And often if you're doing that, you're likely to leave a lot of value on the table. And that is going to lead you to losing in a lot more weeks. But the goal is trying to hit big when you kind of get it all together. So now let's go back to the 3M here, just so we get a better look at the whole chart. So we can see here the optimal left 900 left over, but in the single entries in the 3 max, the winning lineups were leaving a lot less, 0, 0, and even the 20 max left 200 on the table. Whereas once you get to the 150 max, now we can leave a little bit more, left 500 on the table, and 300, not really that much. But if you're looking to win here, you got to leave some money on the table for especially in the large buy-in events. If we're looking through the rest of here, what I want to kind of talk about now is ownership. Now, obviously, ownership and what are considered chalk plays is something people are always trying to deviate and pivot from. But I think what you'll see in almost every week is that people are getting better and better at understanding who's going to win these events. And a lot of the touts or anybody else who are talking about these events, they're touting up good plays. They're not doing it just to throw money away. They're finding players who have some version of good course history, some good recent form. And so when we're looking at this, we can see that Sungjae Im at 20%, Tony Finau 23%, Cam Davis 30%. We're all in the top 10 in the we're all top 10 in DK points, but also really highly owned. Now, when you get into the cheaper plays in the 6 and 7K range, these are the plays where you can try to figure out ways to pivot. When you've got 15% owned for a player in the 7K range, that to me is where you're going to want to pivot away from it. But when you're at the 8K and above range, it's often we're finding players who are still valuable plays and still getting a lot of points. Adam Hadwin was highly talked up this week, 17% owned. Maverick McNeely, 28%. And while they didn't necessarily pay off, they still would have made you money if you put them in your cash game lineups because you still need to get 6 to 6 through. This week, we saw that the 6 to 6 percentage was right around 5% in most events. So just getting 6 to 6 through is going to get you a profit. But getting to the top, you needed to have Finau, Im, Grillo, and Hoagie. Now, I did want to take a look at something here, looking at the course history of these players. Who here has played this event before and shown a propensity to succeed? So if we look at Tony Finau, he's had 3 finishes here, all inside the top 30, including a 3rd place in 2020. We had, where is he here? Cam Champ won this event last year, the defending champion. Emiliano Grillo finished 3rd here in 2020. We had, who else do we have here? Pardon me, folks. I'm looking over the. Tom Hoagie had made 2 cuts here. He finished 23rd and 46th in 2019 and 2020. But that doesn't mean that playing here the first time doesn't mean you can't be successful. Grayson Sigg, Tom Kim, Danny Willett, Callum Tarrant, who all finished in the top 10. This was their first time playing this event. Now, this event doesn't have a whole long history of being played at before. It's only been around for now. This is this 4th year. So having said that, it's easy to see that you don't have to have a lot of experience to be able to have a huge advantage, but it doesn't hurt having it on there. Next thing I want to take a look at here is recent finishes and also who played at the Open and came over here. So a lot of talk was, does it hurt players a lot to have come back here coming across from the British Open to play this week? Well, Tony Finau finished 28th last week at the Open, came here and won the event. Sungjae Im was at the Open, didn't play well, did make the cut, finished 81st, but still got here and finished in the top 6. Who else do we have playing there? Other than that, Emiliano Grillo played the Open but missed a cut, so he conceivably had a couple extra days to prepare for it. Tom Kim finished 47th at the British Open. Danny Willett finished 53rd. Tom Hoagie played and missed the cut. So I think moving forward for next year, let's make sure that we don't just eliminate players just because they played the British Open. I know I tended to overvalue, flying across time zones and being that way, but at the same time, these guys have done it their whole lives, so they're used to it at this point. Something else I was looking at too is trying to figure out which events correlate with success here. So one that we found that had shown some correlation is at the John Deere. We had Cam Davis, who finished 8th there and played well this week. JT Poston played well this week. We had Cheston Hadley, who finished in the top 20, finished 10th at the John Deere. Callum Tarrant finished 6th at the John Deere, and now finished top 10 here. So looking for events where we can start to see flashes as they come into this event. Those are ones that kind of popped up here. To kind of wrap all this up here, want to kind of finish talking about when we're going for the optimal lineup. It's not just about trying to figure out what is the perfect lineup, how do we get there? It's what kind of ranges should we be focusing on? And so when we're looking here, there are only 7 players that were priced at the 9K and up range, with 2 of them at the 10K range. So in this weaker field, there are only 3 10K players: Tony Finau, Sungjae Im, and Hideki Matsuyama. Now, Matsuyama, there's a lot of talk about him going over to live. Was he really here to really play, or was he just trying to get his game together? Well, played one bad round, withdrew with a wrist injury apparently, but he left. But the other 2 players both made it into the optimal lineup. it's in that 8 and 9K range that essentially DraftKings is trying to find players to fill in these slots with players who aren't necessarily great players, but just because of the field being this weak, that's who they had to go for. I imagine next week's field is going to be pretty similar in quality, and we'll see once we see the full list and who ends up dropping out and who fills those spots. But I think next week, let's look for the same things. We're looking for a couple top end guys in that 10K range. We're going to have to eat that chalk and try to pivot through with the rest of the range. Let's take a look at, see if you can find builds from that event there. Give me 1 second here. So at the Rocket Mortgage, we've seen from a lineup build standpoint. So back in 2016, with a 9-8-7-7-7-6, so 3 guys in the 7K range. Then we had a 10-9-7-7-7-6, a 9-8-8-7-6-6, 2020, 10-8-7-6-6-6, and then last year 2 9s and 8 and 3 7s. So when I first look at this, I'm looking down here and seeing there's a lot of money left over in the optimals. If you can handle it, you have you're risk averse enough to leave money on the table to try to chase after a more elite lineup. You gotta do it. We've only got, looks like here, almost 3,000 left over in these lineups, focusing strongly on the 6 and 7K range. I mean, you can see here in half the time it's 4 of the guys are either 7 or 6K, with only a couple guys up in the 9 and 10K range. So while at least in this one there's 9K players in here, whereas in the 3M there was never a 9K player that even made this. Only an 8K player made it twice in those lineups. So there's some value in finding a player in the 9 and 8K range. But my guess here is that it's going to be some version of one 10K player, one 9 and 8, and then a couple 7s and a couple 6s. When we're looking at the optimals here for which ones happen most often with a 10K, you can see that the most common build that has been the optimal is this one, happened 17 times now, 10-9-8-7-7-6. Pretty classic lineup where you've got an elite player, an up-and-coming player, a value range, and then you got 2 7s and a 6. I feel like this one's going to have a little bit more of the 7s and 6 involved. So I'm thinking it's going to be some version of a 10-9-7-7-7-6. This is also the second most common build. So I'll look to focus in kind of this range of build. Once you see the players, once we see, how they're getting priced at, what the leverage price is going to be at. But I'm willing to eat chalk in the 10 and 9K range here and look for kind of see what players project in that 7 to 12% range in the 7K range, and then look to just find whoever has the most quality value in the 6K range. So this is someone you're going to want to usually find with a good course history. These 3 guys are probably going to have some version of a relatively weak recent results, but or have course history who are going to pop. And then the 10 and 9K guys are usually a combination of playing well recently and having some course history that made them play well. All right, so we go through here. I think we've hit all the points I wanted to talk about. All these stats and information were brought by Fantasy National. I do also want to shout out Rick Gaiman, who's been kind of guiding me in finding a topic I want to discuss. I know I rambled and I wasn't very super clear in my thoughts and discussion here, but it's my first attempt. I'm going to do this every week, Sunday afternoons after the event closes. Once I have all the data I need to see what happened in the event, I'm going to go over as much as I can for talking about what players were successful, what players were hurting our lineups, where we can pivot to next time, what the optimals are, and what people are using for their buy-ins. I think this one was a little unique in that we had 4 of the guys in the optimal lineups were used quite often in pretty much every other event here. You can see that the only one where they didn't use one of the 4 was in the 150 max 350K. But having put all those together, let's see if we can start to build better lineups, better quality, and take down a big one. And with that, guys, I want to thank you for giving me a shot. Hopefully next week I clean this up a little bit, make it a little simpler, a little more organized. I'm still kind of learning this on the fly, so I appreciate it. Have a great night and good luck to you.